The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls as 12-year-old Daniel Murphy pressed himself against the weathered wall of the general store, his thin body trembling with fear as he watched three men in expensive suits approach with the measured steps of predators who had cornered their prey. The men represented the Territorial Children's Aid Society, an organization that claimed to place orphaned children in suitable homes, but which Daniel had learned was little more than a front for supplying cheap labor to anyone willing to pay. Their fees. Daniel had been running for 3 days now, ever since escaping from the Morrison work farm, where children as young as 8 were forced to labor 16 hours a day in conditions that would have been illegal for adult prisoners. His clothes were little more than rags held together by hope and determination. His face was gaunt with hunger, and his bare feet were cut and bleeding from traveling rough ground without shoes. But his eyes, green as spring grass and filled with an intelligence that seemed far too old for his young face, burned with the desperate courage of someone who would rather die free than live in chains. "There he is!" called out Marcus Webb, the lead agent from the Children's Aid Society, his voice carrying the kind of false authority that men used when they had legal power but no moral right to exercise it. Daniel Murphy, aged 12, ward of the territorial government and property of the state until he reaches his majority. The casual way Webb referred to Daniel as property made several townspeople look uncomfortable, but none of them moved to interfere as the three men spread out to prevent any possibility of escape. Cedar Falls was a small frontier town where people minded their own business and avoided confrontations with territorial authorities, even when those authorities were engaged in activities that violated every principle of human decency. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized that his desperate flight was about to come to an end. In failure and a return to the nightmare he had risked everything to escape. The Morrison work farm was a place where children died from exhaustion, disease, and despair, their small bodies buried in unmarked graves, while the territorial government collected fees for their care and rehabilitation. "Please," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a desperation that made even hardened adults stop and listen. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to be free, to work for myself and keep what I earn. Why can't you just leave me alone?" "Because you're a minor child with no family to care for you," Webb replied, with the kind of bureaucratic coldness that reduced human suffering to paperwork and procedures. "The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure you receive proper supervision and moral guidance until you're old enough to care for yourself." Proper supervision. Daniel's voice cracked with emotion as he thought about the horrors he had witnessed at the work farm. "You call it proper supervision when children are beaten for being too sick to work? When they're given moldy bread and dirty water while the supervisors eat real food? When they die and get buried without even a marker to show they existed?" The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, and several townspeople began to murmur among themselves as they realized that the boy was describing conditions that went far beyond strict discipline into the realm of systematic abuse. But Webb's expression didn't change, showing the kind of indifference that came from years of ignoring inconvenient truths in favor of profitable arrangements. "The boy is obviously disturbed and prone to wild exaggerations," Webb said dismissively. "All the more reason why he needs proper institutional care to correct his antisocial tendencies." As the three agents closed in on Daniel, preparing to drag him back to a fate that would likely mean death within months, an unexpected voice cut through the tension like a sword through silk. "Hold on there, gentlemen. What seems to be the problem?" The voice belonged to Samuel Weatherford, a man whose reputation throughout the territory was so formidable that even territorial agents thought twice before crossing him. At 68 years old, Samuel was one of the most successful ranchers in 3 counties, owner of the sprawling Double W Ranch that employed more than 50 men and controlled grazing rights to nearly 100,000 acres of prime cattle country. But Samuel's influence went far beyond mere wealth. He was a man who had fought in the territorial wars, who had served as territorial representative for 6 terms, and whose word carried weight with governors, judges, and federal officials throughout the region. More importantly, he was known as a man whose moral principles were as solid as the mountains that bordered his ranch, someone who had never hesitated to use his considerable power to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "Mr. Weatherford," Webb said nervously, clearly recognizing the rancher and understanding that his presence complicated what should have been a simple retrieval operation. "We're just collecting a runaway ward of the state. Nothing that need concern you, sir." Samuel studied the scene with the kind of careful attention that had made him successful in business and politics, taking in Daniel's obvious terror, the agent's aggressive positioning, and the uncomfortable expressions of the townspeople who were witnessing the confrontation. "Ward of the state, you say?" Samuel replied thoughtfully. "And what exactly has this boy done to warrant being hunted down like a common criminal?" "He's an orphan who was placed in approved care and chose to run away rather than fulfill his obligations," Webb said, his voice taking on a defensive tone as he realized that Samuel's questions were leading somewhere he didn't want to go. "Obligations?" Samuel's eyebrows rose with the kind of dangerous calm that those who knew him well recognized as a sign of impending trouble for whoever had earned his displeasure. "What kind of obligations does a 12-year-old boy have that require 3 grown men to track him down?" Daniel saw his chance and took it, stepping away from the wall and addressing Samuel directly with the kind of desperate honesty that was his only remaining weapon. "Sir, please don't let them take me. They want to send me back to the Morrison work farm, where children are worked to death and buried in unmarked graves. I know I'm just an orphan with no family to speak for me, but I'm begging you to help me." Raw desperation in Daniel's voice seemed to strike Samuel like a physical blow, and the old rancher's expression darkened with the kind of anger that had made him feared by those who mistook his generally gentle nature for weakness. "The Morrison work farm?" Samuel repeated, his voice carrying undertones that made Webb and his associates exchange nervous glances. "I've heard some disturbing stories about that operation. Stories about children being used as slave labor under conditions that would be considered criminal if applied to adult workers. Those are just rumors and exaggerations," Webb said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction as he faced a man whose reputation for uncovering the truth was legendary throughout the territory. Samuel knelt down to Daniel's level, his weathered face showing the kind of gentle concern that the boy hadn't seen from an adult in years. "Son," he said quietly, "tell me exactly what happened at this work farm. Don't leave anything out, and don't worry about these men hearing what you have to say." Daniel looked into Samuel's eyes and saw something he had almost forgotten existed. Genuine compassion, backed by the power to act on that compassion. For the first time in months, he felt hope stirring in his chest as he realized that he might have found someone willing to stand between him and the forces that wanted to destroy him. "They make children work from before sunrise until after dark," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Breaking rocks, digging ditches, cleaning stables, whatever needs doing. The food is barely fit for animals, and if you get sick or injured, they just work you harder until you either recover or die. I saw 3 children die while I was there, sir, and they buried them without even recording their names." The detailed account of systematic abuse was delivered with the kind of factual precision that made it impossible to dismiss as childish exaggeration, and Samuel's expression grew grimmer with each horrific detail that Daniel revealed. "Mr. Weatherford," Webb interrupted desperately. "The boy is obviously a habitual liar who will say anything to avoid returning to proper supervision. You can't possibly believe these wild accusations." Samuel rose to his full height, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the three agents as he fixed them with the kind of stare that had made hardened criminals confess their crimes without being asked. "Gentlemen," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command and absolute moral certainty, "I suggest you return to your superiors and inform them that Daniel Murphy is no longer available for placement in any of their facilities." "You can't just take custody of a ward of the state," Webb protested, though his voice showed his growing awareness that he was dealing with someone whose influence might trump his bureaucratic authority. "Can't I?" Samuel asked with the kind of smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Perhaps you'd like to explain that to Governor Morrison when I discuss this situation with him next week. Or maybe you'd prefer to explain it to Federal Marshal Thompson when I file formal charges of child abuse against the Morrison work farm." The mention of the governor and federal marshal sent visible shock through the three agents, who clearly hadn't expected to encounter someone with the kind of political connections that could end their careers and possibly their freedom. "The territorial legislature is very interested in reports of corruption in the children's aid system," Samuel continued relentlessly. "I'm sure they'd be fascinated to hear about the conditions this boy has described, especially since I happen to chair the committee that oversees territorial expenditures for child welfare." As the three agents realized that they had stumbled into a confrontation with someone who possessed both the will and the power to destroy their entire operation, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents died: the absolute certainty that someone was going to protect him no matter what the cost. The standoff in Cedar Falls Main Street stretched taut as a bowstring as Samuel Weatherford faced down the three territorial agents, his imposing presence creating an invisible barrier between Daniel and the men who wanted to drag him back to a life of forced labor and probable death. The old rancher's reputation for both fairness and implacable determination when defending his principles had made him a legend throughout the territory, and even federal officials thought carefully before challenging his decisions. "Mr. Weatherford," Webb said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a man who suddenly realized he was badly outmatched, "surely you understand that we have legal procedures to follow. The boy is a ward of the territorial government, and we have proper documentation authorizing his placement." Samuel's response was to reach into his coat and produce a leather portfolio that contained the kind of official documents that could change lives with the stroke of a pen. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I happen to carry a commission as a special territorial marshal, granted by Governor Morrison himself for the specific purpose of investigating irregularities in government operations. Consider yourselves and your organization officially under investigation." The revelation that Samuel possessed law enforcement authority sent visible shock through the three agents, who had assumed they were dealing with a wealthy rancher rather than someone with actual legal power to interfere with their operations. Daniel watched with amazement as the men who had seemed so confident and threatening just moments before began to show signs of genuine fear. "Furthermore," Samuel continued, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without interruption, "I am hereby exercising my authority as a territorial marshal to place this boy in protective custody pending a full investigation into the conditions at the Morrison work farm and other facilities operated by your organization." "You can't do that," Webb protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction as he realized that Samuel's legal authority might indeed supersede their bureaucratic mandates. "Actually, I can," Samuel replied, with the kind of smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. In fact, I'm required to do so when presented with credible evidence of child abuse and systematic corruption. Daniel's testimony provides more than sufficient grounds for immediate protective action. The old rancher turned to address the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation, his voice carrying across the street with the kind of commanding presence that had made him one of the territory's most respected leaders. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," Samuel said formally, "I call upon you to witness that I am taking Daniel Murphy into protective custody under the authority vested in me by the territorial government. Any attempt to interfere with this protective custody will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation." The public declaration created a moment of stunned silence as everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to the territorial children's aid system by someone with both the authority and the courage to follow through on his threats. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with wonder at the dramatic reversal of his fortunes, "what does protective custody mean? What's going to happen to me now?" Samuel knelt down to Daniel's level again, his weathered face showing the kind of gentle reassurance that the boy desperately needed. "It means you're coming home with me to the W Ranch, son. It means you're going to be safe, well-fed, and treated with the respect that every human being deserves. And it means that anyone who wants to hurt you is going to have to explain themselves to me personally." The promise of safety and protection was more than Daniel had dared to hope for, but he was an intelligent boy who understood that powerful men often made promises they didn't intend to keep when the immediate crisis had passed. "Mr. Weatherford," Daniel said carefully, "I don't want to be a burden on you. I can work for my keep and I won't cause any trouble. I just want a chance to grow up free instead of being worked to death in some government facility." "Son," Samuel said gently, "you're not going to be a burden on anyone. You're going to be part of my family if you're willing to accept that arrangement. The W Ranch is always in need of intelligent young men who are willing to learn and work hard, and I suspect you possess both qualities in abundance." The offer of not just protection, but actual family membership was so unexpected that Daniel felt tears springing to his eyes, despite his efforts to maintain the emotional control that had helped him survive so much hardship. "I would be honored to be part of your family, sir," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he had been holding back for months. As Samuel helped Daniel into his wagon for the journey to the W Ranch, Webb made one final desperate attempt to assert his authority. "Mr. Weatherford, this is highly irregular. There will be official complaints filed, investigations initiated. You're interfering with legitimate government operations." Samuel's response was delivered with the kind of cold finality that ended conversations permanently. "Mr. Webb, when those investigations begin, I suggest you have excellent explanations for the conditions this boy has described. Because if even half of what he's told me is true, there are going to be criminal charges filed that will put you and your associates in federal prison for a very long time." The wagon ride to the W Ranch passed in comfortable silence as Daniel tried to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened to his life. The desperate fugitive who had been facing capture and return to slavery had somehow found himself under the protection of one of the most powerful men in the territory, with promises of safety and family membership that seemed too good to be true. The W Ranch house appeared through the evening mist like something from a dream. Its large windows glowing with warm light and its wraparound porch, suggesting the kind of domestic comfort that Daniel had never experienced. The main building was surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings, corrals filled with prime cattle, and the general atmosphere of prosperity that came from efficient management and honest dealing. "Welcome home, Daniel," Samuel said as they approached the house. "I know this must all seem overwhelming, but I want you to understand something important. You're not here as a charity case or a temporary arrangement. You're here as my adopted son, with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that position." The word son hit Daniel like a physical blow, carrying implications of belonging and security that he had never dared to hope for since his parents' death. "Sir," he said quietly, "I don't know how to be someone's son. I've been on my own for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be part of a family." "We'll figure it out together," Samuel replied with the kind of patient warmth that suggested he understood the challenges of building trust with a child who had been betrayed by every adult authority he had encountered. Samuel's housekeeper, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, emerged from the house as they approached, her maternal instincts immediately focusing on the thin, raggedly dressed boy who was clearly in need of care and attention. "Madre de Dios," she murmured, taking in Daniel's obvious malnutrition and exhaustion. "Samuel, where did you find this poor child?" "Elena, meet Daniel Murphy, my new son," Samuel said simply. "He's had a rough time of it, but he's home now. I was hoping you could help him get cleaned up and fed while I send some messages to friends in the territorial government." Mrs. Rodriguez's response was immediate and maternal, bustling Daniel into the house with the kind of efficient kindness that suggested she had experience caring for children who needed healing as much as food and shelter. As Daniel found himself seated at a kitchen table laden with more food than he had seen in months, being fussed over by a woman who seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare, he began to understand that his life had indeed changed in ways that went far beyond simple rescue from immediate danger. "Eat slowly, mijo," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently, recognizing the signs of someone who had been hungry for too long. "There's plenty of food, and no one is going to take it away from you. You're safe now." The simple assurance of safety and abundance was almost more than Daniel could process after months of constant fear and deprivation. But as he sat in the warm kitchen of the Double W Ranch, surrounded by adults who seemed genuinely committed to his welfare, he began to believe that the nightmare of his orphaned existence might finally be coming to an end. Meanwhile, Samuel was in his study, composing telegrams to political allies throughout the territory who would ensure that Daniel's new status as his adopted son would be legally unassailable and politically protected. The boy who had begged, "Sir, please don't, let them take me," had indeed found someone willing to do more than just prevent his capture. He had found a father who would move heaven and earth to ensure that his new son would never again be at the mercy of those who viewed children as disposable commodities rather than precious human beings worthy of love and protection. Subscribe to our channel now to see how Daniel's new life unfolds and what it truly means to be made untouchable by love and power. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in Cedar Falls, when Samuel Weatherford had faced down 3 territorial agents to protect a desperate orphan boy, and the transformation in Daniel Murphy during that time was nothing short of miraculous. The frightened, malnourished child who had begged for protection had grown into a confident young man whose intelligence and character had earned respect throughout the territory, not just as Samuel's adopted son, but as an individual worthy of admiration in his own right. Daniel, now 14, had thrived under Samuel's patient guidance and Mrs. Rodriguez's maternal care, developing from a boy who had known only survival into someone who understood his own worth and potential. His education had been entrusted to the finest tutors that money could hire. His physical development had been nurtured through proper nutrition and outdoor work on the ranch, and his character had been shaped by Samuel's example of using power responsibly and treating all people with dignity regardless of their station in life. But more importantly, Samuel had kept his promise to make Daniel untouchable by those who might seek to harm him. Through a combination of legal adoption, political connections, and careful documentation of the abuse Daniel had suffered in territorial custody, the old rancher had created a protective barrier around his son that even federal authorities were reluctant to challenge. "Daniel," Samuel said one autumn morning as they rode together across the vast expanse of the Double W Ranch, checking on cattle and enjoying the kind of father-son companionship that had become the foundation of both their lives. "I've received some interesting news from the territorial capital that I think you should hear." Daniel, who had learned to read the subtle signs in Samuel's voice that indicated important conversations, straightened in his saddle and gave his adoptive father his full attention. Over the past 2 years, these talks had become precious to him, moments when Samuel treated him as an equal partner in understanding the complex world of territorial politics and business. "What kind of news, Father?" Daniel asked, using the title that had come naturally after months of experiencing genuine paternal care and protection. "The territorial legislature has completed its investigation into the Children's Aid Society and the Morrison Work Farm," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a satisfaction that came from seeing justice finally served. "Marcus Webb and his associates have been arrested on federal charges of child abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The Morrison Work Farm has been shut down permanently, and the surviving children have been placed in legitimate care with families who will actually treat them properly." The news hit Daniel like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it represented the final vindication of everything he had risked his life to escape. The nightmarish facility where he had watched children die from overwork and neglect had finally been exposed and destroyed, its operators facing the kind of justice that their victims had never received. "What about the children who died there?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "The ones who were buried without names or markers? The territorial government has established a fund to provide proper burial and memorialization for all the children who died in territorial custody," Samuel replied gently. "It's not enough to bring them back, but it's something, and it ensures that their deaths weren't completely meaningless if they help prevent other children from suffering the same fate." Daniel nodded, understanding that justice for the dead was limited, but that preventing future tragedies was the best memorial possible for those who had not survived to see their tormentors brought to account. "There's something else," Samuel continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when delivering news that was both important and potentially challenging. "The investigation has made you something of a celebrity throughout the territory. Newspapers are calling you the boy whose courage exposed a corrupt system, and there are people who want to meet you, perhaps offer you opportunities that could shape your entire future." The idea of being famous for his suffering was deeply uncomfortable to Daniel, who had never sought attention or recognition for surviving the Morrison Work Farm. "Father," he said carefully, "I don't want to be famous for being a victim. I want to be known for what I accomplish, not for what was done to me." Samuel's smile showed the kind of pride that came from watching a young man develop exactly the kind of character that would serve him well throughout life. "That's exactly the attitude I hoped you would have," he said approvingly. "But I think you should know that Governor Morrison wants to meet with you, and there are people in Washington who are interested in your testimony for potential federal legislation about child welfare." The prospect of testifying before government officials was both exciting and terrifying for a 14-year-old who still sometimes had nightmares about his experiences in territorial custody. But Daniel had learned from Samuel's example that with privilege came responsibility, and that using his voice to protect other children was more important than his personal comfort. "If my testimony can help other children, then I'll do whatever is necessary," Daniel said firmly. "But I want to make sure that any laws that get passed actually protect children instead of just creating more bureaucracy for corrupt officials to hide behind." The mature perspective on the relationship between good intentions and effective implementation impressed Samuel with its sophistication, confirming his belief that Daniel possessed the kind of practical wisdom that would make him a formidable advocate for social justice. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider approaching at high speed across the ranch's rolling pastures, clearly bearing urgent news that couldn't wait for normal communication channels. As the horseman drew closer, they could see it was Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, whose weathered face showed the kind of concern that usually preceded serious problems. "Mr. Weatherford," Tom called out as he reined in his lathered horse, "we've got trouble coming up the main road. Federal marshals, maybe 6 or 8 of them, riding hard like they're on official business." The news that federal marshals were approaching the ranch sent a chill through Daniel's heart as he remembered the terror of being hunted by territorial agents 2 years earlier. Despite Samuel's assurances about his legal protection, the boy couldn't entirely shake the fear that powerful forces might still find ways to drag him back into the system that had nearly killed him. "It's all right, son," Samuel said quietly, noting Daniel's obvious anxiety. "Whatever this is about, you're under my protection, and that protection extends to federal authorities as well as territorial ones." As they rode back toward the ranch house, they could see the approaching dust cloud that marked the progress of the federal marshals across the prairie. But as the riders drew closer, Samuel's expression showed recognition rather than concern, suggesting that these were not strangers bent on hostile action. "That's Marshal Thompson in the lead," Samuel said with evident relief. "He's an old friend who's worked with me on several territorial investigations. This is probably about your testimony for the federal hearings, not any attempt to challenge your status here." Marshal Thompson, a man in his 50s whose reputation for integrity and fairness was legendary throughout the Western Territories, dismounted at the ranch house with the kind of respectful manner that suggested he understood he was visiting someone whose influence matched his own. "Samuel," Marshal Thompson said warmly, "good to see you again. And this must be Daniel Murphy, the young man whose courage has made him famous from here to Washington." "Marshal Thompson," Daniel replied politely, though his voice still carried traces of the wariness that came from too many encounters with representatives of government authority. "Son," Marshal Thompson said gently, "I want you to know that I'm here as a friend, not as someone who wants to disrupt the life you've built here. But there are some important people in Washington who believe your testimony could help pass legislation that would protect thousands of children throughout the territories." The marshal's respectful tone and obvious deference to Samuel's authority helped Daniel relax, as he realized that this was indeed about using his experiences to help others, rather than any attempt to challenge his newfound security and family. "What exactly are they asking of me?" Daniel asked, his natural intelligence focusing on the practical implications of whatever testimony might be required. "The Senate Subcommittee on Territorial Affairs is holding hearings on child welfare legislation," Marshal Thompson explained. "They want first-hand testimony from someone who survived the kind of conditions that the new laws are designed to prevent. Your experiences at the Morrison work farm, combined with your obvious intelligence and character, make you the ideal witness to demonstrate both the problems and the potential solutions." Samuel placed a protective hand on Daniel's shoulder as he addressed the marshal directly. "Will Daniel's safety and legal status be guaranteed throughout this process? I won't allow my son to be used for political purposes and then abandoned when his usefulness ends." "Absolutely," Marshal Thompson replied without hesitation. In fact, the federal government is prepared to offer Daniel additional protections that would make his legal status unassailable by any territorial or federal authority. Think of it as insurance that ensures he can never again be at the mercy of corrupt officials. The offer of federal protection was more than Daniel had ever dared to hope for, representing not just security for himself, but the power to help other children who might face the same horrors he had survived. "I'll do it," Daniel said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had sustained him through his darkest moments. "If my testimony can help pass laws that protect children, then it's the right thing to do, regardless of any personal cost." 3 months later, Daniel Murphy stood before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Territorial Affairs in Washington, D.C., delivering testimony that would be quoted in history books and remembered as a turning point in federal child welfare policy. His detailed account of conditions at the Morrison work farm, combined with his obvious intelligence and moral authority as a survivor, provided exactly the kind of compelling evidence that legislators needed to pass comprehensive child protection laws. But more importantly, Daniel's testimony established him as more than just a survivor or even a victim who had found justice. It established him as an advocate whose voice would carry weight in the halls of power for decades to come, someone whose early experiences with injustice had been transformed into the foundation for a lifetime of service to those who couldn't protect themselves. When Samuel Weatherford had promised to make Daniel untouchable, he had delivered on that promise in ways that went far beyond mere physical protection. He had given Daniel the education, connections, and moral foundation that would make him a force for justice throughout his life, someone whose influence would ultimately protect thousands of children who would never know his name, but would benefit from the laws his courage had helped create. The boy who had once begged, "Sir, please don't let them take me," had become a man whose own power would ensure that no other child would ever have to make such a desperate plea for protection from those who were supposed to care for them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of courage, justice, and the power of one person to change the world. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the triumph of good over evil.